So in the previous video, we've seen that Ross is, with some arguments that do, have some difficulty. But the point is that right, this notion of right that we have, we use it, and it's primitive. It doesn't have any internal structure. You can talk about maybe in sense of an obligation, but that's it. You really can't unpack it in terms of other things. And he says, if you look at history, this is how people have basically thought of it. So now, Ross has a little discussion of history, but there's a couple of things that you have to accept. For instance, he thinks there has been moral progress. If that we have got better at seeing the difference between right and wrong. So, and I use C with scare quotes because you can't point to it. It's not a literal thing like a color like red. So there has been moral progress. Now, think about this. How is this possible? What do we mean by moral progress? If we accept that it happens, how is this possible? Well, he says, in the past, communities, like a community X, and you have a past, like a community X and its moral code Z. Ross says that even in the past, it wasn't the case that people saw their current code, right, that Z, so that X didn't see that Z is identical to right, that it's just perfect. No, he says that some of them, reformers, right, some people would, sure, but how does moral progress work? Well, you have reformers, and what essentially is a reformer able to do? Well, a reformer is able to look at the current situation and say, there's a problem with this. This isn't right. We do R, S, and T, we're doing these kinds of things. That's not right, right? So it's not that everything we do is terrible. Our set of moral codes is fine, but it's an approximation of the right. We should be making it a little better. So this idea of moral progress, things getting better, presupposes that there is the ability to, quote unquote, see a distinction between what is and what could be. And that ultimately is because there is a kind of higher or some other thing that's right, that your system is an approximation of. So reformers are really the people that just have a certain level. It's not necessarily mystical or whatever. They have a certain kind of developed sense of seeing and understanding, if you like. Such that they can see, they can look at what is and go, well, maybe we could make this better, right? Trying to make a better society. So someone who is reform-minded, we might say, always has that sense of right that they're grasping for. So in that sense, people could see how their own society codes could be improved. So there's nothing mystical here. So that there just simply is a distinction between right and what is. And it has a Platonic ring, but it doesn't have to have a mystical dimension to it. So, and of course, if there isn't a distinction, Ross says, think about that. If a societal code, which is implicit in his discussion, if a societal code is the right, then even an attempt to try and modify it would be moving your societal code away from the right. And if you move it away from a right, you're degenerating it, so that's an immoral action. So even the idea of reform, if your society is perfect, any attempts to reform perfection is a denigration. All right, so even attempts to change something is, that's wrong by the very definition of the term. Of course, if you reject the notion of moral progress, then this discussion of Ross's is not going to carry much weight with you. It'll pretty well lose over all of its force. Now, again, what is this access? Okay, so if you agree with this, that there's been moral progress, and where we just, hey, we look at some things and we go, back then people didn't see the problem with that, and we look and it's just glaring to us, So if you doubt Ross's point, go look at some older debates. Look at debates in slavery in the 19th century. Look at debates over women voting and stuff like that. And sometimes you think, why would anyone see it this way, or why did people even think that needed a debate? So that's the kind of moral progress if we if in the Rossian sense, and we just look at these things and we just see a distinction or a direction that people didn't see before. Okay, so but what is this seeing that I keep talking about, right? I put it in scare quotes because it's not seeing as in seeing colors and objects. What is this seeing? What is this access to this right? Well, Ross is going to unpack this more throughout the book, but he says, look, some acts are just self-evidently right? So you just see the obligatory nature of them. So the right characterizes acts, and you can just see it, that it's right to treat people equally, or whatever the case may be. So now, so suppose that Q is an act, and that Q is right. So it is the case that Q is a morally obligatory action, right? It's a duty to do Q. He says, look, ultimately, this is going to be like a self-evident proposition that Q is right? That's self-evident. Now, just because this, shall we say, this proposition Q is self-evident, that doesn't mean that self-evident is something that just everybody sees, that everybody just instantly grasps. No, he doesn't think that at all. So in other words, something that's self-evident, it may not be self-evident for everyone. It doesn't mean that just any mind and every mind can instantly grasp that. Rather, Ross says that it's not going to be for everyone, but only for the minds that have a maturity. The mature mind has the ability to grasp this, to understand. Now, if this sounds, kind of flaky or mystical, think of it this way. We often talk about certain things are acquired abilities, right? The ability to grasp. So you can think of it roughly. You can learn how to read an ultrasound, right? You've got a certain level of training so that in this situation, if I look at it, I don't know what's going on, but somebody who's properly trained can, grasp what's going on. The properly trained mind, it's self-evident that, it's female or male, something like that. Whereas that's, it's self-evident, but I'd say, maybe it's self-evident to you. It's not self-evident to me. So there's a very non-mystical way of something being self-evident, but it's not self-evident from birth. It's not like, that you're just born, you know how to read an ultrasound. It's not self-evident like that. But Ross says, that doesn't matter. Something can be self-evident in the terms of you've acquired through training and maturation the ability to see, to grasp immediately. And that's how training usually works. So same thing in art, grasping and understanding certain aspects of art might need training. And then once you, as the saying goes, once you eventually can grasp it and see it, you can't help but see it. So I would imagine that if you train to read ultrasounds, you can't look at one and not see what's going on in there. It's self-evident and you can't stop it. Whereas, again, I can't tell what's going on in one of those things. So a certain level of maturity. How do minds mature? Well, the analog was training. Minds mature but my training example is like the individual, right? So from somebody who begins med school and then goes through the training. So there's that individual maturation, or one from childhood to adulthood. But on the other hand, minds mature over generations as well. Hence, we look at things that maybe people in the 19th century couldn't see, that something was wrong, and that's all we see. We can't help but see it as wrong, or we can't take neutral stands on something because we see that it's immoral. So this is what Ross is saying, that you just start to be able to see this. So and so his education, history, and development mature the mind, and just like they mature the individual, they also mature us in terms of societies, become better at seeing these things. So on a historical note, Ross thinks there's moral progress, but he also thinks that, what we're interested in is still, the right. It's one thing to study as like anthropologists do, to study ethical systems. He thinks that's all very interesting. You go and you visit certain cultures and groups, and you study what they thought was right and wrong. And that's a descriptive type of approach, and that's very important. But he doesn't think that that can replace moral philosophy. Descriptive natures simply are just that. They're descriptive in nature, and they talk about what various ethical ideas these cultures had, and today, yesterday, or whatnot. But he says that the human mind will not rest. So he lands on a sort of a psychological note. We find that intrinsically unsatisfying to just talk about different systems, right? To always remain at the level of difference, which is a kind of relativism, right? If you're just descriptive, you just say, well, society X does this. There's their codes, right? They have their code Z, and another culture has its code, and that's all you can say from a descriptive mode, because there isn't any place to stand, because in a way, you've gotten rid of this notion of right. That's gone. There's just various codes. And Ross thinks that the mind can't help. One thing we can't help is to judge, right? We can't help but see some ethical codes as better than others, right? You may not want to admit it, but Ross thinks that we just can't help but say that the mind just, it can't help it. It's got again another case of this insight, right? That once you get sophisticated and developed and matured, you can't help but just see that some ethical systems are going to be better. He says we have an a priori insight into this, into very broad principles of morality, and we can just recognize better and worse instantiations. So we have this kind of insight into broad principles, not particular acts or whatever. We have something, that like on this wavelength, we can have intuitions on these sort of particular acts, but we also have broad principles, and we can see which ones are better approximations, which cultures or which systems are better approximations of these broad moral principles. We can just do that, and that's what we're really after. And so it's not just that there is, a variety of systems. Ross says, no, at the end of it all, that there is a system of moral truth. And it's as objective as all truth must be. Truth is objective. Don't say my truth. There's only truth. You don't have a truth. You may have your opinion, but you don't have truth. Truth is something that's objective, and we're interested in discovering this truth, this system of moral truths, this whatever right is ultimately connected to, and the ramifications of it. Sociology, history, they can tell you the story of various attempts and various approximations. That's all very interesting and a worthwhile study. Ross is not denigrating that, but he nonetheless insists that that's not going to be, it is not moral philosophy. Moral philosophy is not reducible to history or sociology or anthropology, and we would never be satisfied with that, because the domain of philosophy gives us answers to certain questions that we most desire to have answered. So in other words, he's very traditional in his view that our highest aspirations really are questions of are philosophical questions, not historical and not sociological questions. So that, this chapter ends on a high note, cheering philosophy on, moral philosophy. We've got right as a fundamental, it's a primitive, there's no internal structure to it. It's something that we can somehow recognize, and it applies to acts. And Ross in the next chapter is going to look at, okay, well, right applies to acts. How do we do this? Like, what makes a right act right? Like, what acts are all different kinds. What makes some of them right acts? So how do we go forward in this investigation? Like, how does right, in other words, how does right show up in our experience?